Throughout the year, we're talking about developments in Russia, Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
Over the last several weeks, U.S. tariff policy has roiled global financial markets. The imposition of what the Trump administration is calling reciprocal tariffs on essentially every country in the world sent markets around the world into freefall, only for Trump to suddenly announce he was pausing most of these tariffs for 90 days, which gave markets a short-term boost. But importantly, while he gave most U.S. trading partners a temporary respite, Trump not only left tariffs on China in place, but raised them to some 125%. What are the reasons for the sudden U.S. hostility toward free trade, and what are its likely consequences? To discuss the tariff war and the possibility of it escalating into an all-out trade war, I'm joined today by Dr. Mark Duckenfield. Mark Duckenfield is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Chair of National Security and a professor of international economics in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. Prior to joining the USAWC, he taught at the Air War College, the London School of Economics, and University College London. He holds an MA and PhD in political science from Harvard University. Mark has held research appointments at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany, and Birkbeck College. He's the author of Business in the Euro, Battles Over Free Trade, Anglo-American Experiences with International Trade, 1776 to 2006, and editor of The History of Financial Disasters, 1763 to 1995.
Well, thank you, Bob. And just before we go on, I'd like to say that my comments today are my personal opinions, not those of the Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense or the U.S. government.
Okay, great. So we're here talking about Trump's tariffs today. And there's been a lot of news over the tariffs in the last week or two. So let's start with the goal, the objective. What is the objective of the tariffs? The White House will do several things. Raise revenue, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., force concessions from other countries on other issues. China fentanyl is one that keeps talking about. China's not doing enough to control the flow of fentanyl to the U.S. So first of all, can they do all these things at once? And secondly, if not, what do you think the objective of the tariffs is?
Well, the tariffs are a tool. And so the question is, the end of this strategy, are they attempt to accomplish? And many of the things that you laid out are entirely appropriate ends that a government could decide to use a tariff for any one of those reasons. But on the other hand, they're not necessarily mutually consistent with each other. Achieving one might be something that prevents you from achieving another. For instance, if you wanted tariffs to raise revenue, but also to bring manufacturing back to the United States, in the fullness of time, if the manufacturing comes back to the United States and the imports constantly drop a lot, then you're not using it for revenue. The revenue dries up because you've achieved the end that you claimed you wanted, which is returning manufacturing to the United States. So there has been some in regard from, at least, from the administration's various economic spokespeople, and ideas put forward as to what the goals should be. We've recently had the relaxation of tariffs just the other day. The goal that they appear to be going with at the moment is a tool to renegotiate international tariff levels and to jumpstart negotiations so that the U.S. can get more payments, also concessions, other non-economic, non-trade areas from countries. The idea of reshoring lots of economic activity, which would mean the tariffs would effectively have to have been permanent because a company's not going to reinvest in the United States and relocate its facilities if the tariffs are suddenly going to be lowered in a few months because of a successful negotiation about various industries, defense spending, or what have you.
So loves predictability, right? We always hear that plan long. If you're going to reshore a factory from offshore, a multi-year, certainly tens of millions of dollars probably in cost. So, and one thing we have not been with these tariffs is predictable. So you're saying go bring America really better way part
where point to that which where so in trade relationship with China as the really big problem. China is a big problem across a whole swathe of things, economic primarily, but also in terms of security and various global norms. So they're very much on China, hence China is not being exempt from this. They think the gloves are off with the Chinese. And there's some wisdom in now doing what they're doing, because if you're going to gear up for a big trade fight with China over intellectual property and all these other things, it's probably not a great idea. It's probably a good idea to get all your allies together who think similarly, that if China's ripping off us, they're also ripping off the Swiss and the British and the Germans and the Japs, and everyone needs to present a united front. And that's the best way to get the Chinese to come aboard. Starting a trade war with all of your allies at the same time opens up not simply a second front, a third front, a fourth front, a 75th front in that, while depriving the U.S. of what could be valuable partners who have common interests in dealing with China.
Yes, so Trump has called this latest round of tariffs, including the ones he paused recently, he's called them reciprocal, claiming they match the tariffs that other countries impose on us. I'm not an economist, but many economists have said the formula the White House is using here is, can you explain the formula and assess your view of reciprocal tariffs, or what are we measuring at the rate?
Well, their argument is that these tariffs, the formula that they use for their rates is really an outcome-based formula, that the U.S. should have a trade balance with every single country, and any deviation from having a trade balance is, on the face of it, prima facie evidence of unfair trade practices, some of which could be tariffs, but they've also increasingly focused on non-tariff barriers as well. Any sort of impediment to that level of equality. So the formula itself is the degree to which the United States has a trade deficit divided by the amount of trade, and that will give you the implicit percentage of the tariff. It doesn't really make sense for determining tariffs. It makes sense as a mathematical formula, but then any mathematical formula would. And then they have a bottom limit for every country of the world of 10%. So even if you're a country that runs the U.S. runs a surplus with. Australia has been a big example, or Madagascar. Even then, you get a 10% tariff. So that's not reciprocal. That's just a straight up American tariff. So that's where it comes from. But usually it's not the case that you have trade balance with every single country in the same way that, you don't have a trade balance with every single person. Someone who, I have a trade balance in my favor with my employer, but I have a real negative trade balance with Home Depot, Harbor, and things like that. I'm not looking at that being an equal exchange. I'm looking at, how the path of that works out. Countries. If the Saudis with a relatively small population and lots of oil are selling to the United States and everyone else lots of oil, it's not at all clear that they need to then buy the same amount from the U.S. or Germany or whatever. They might just be selling a whole lot more than they. If you're a very poor country, say you're Airbus that are and you quantifying some makes the United States the world with each other, and no other country has that. Now, the real benefit for the United States is, if you think about what we're trading with, say, the Chinese or whatever, we're getting lots of iPhones and iPads and little toys and all sorts of other things from the Chinese. And we send to them something that we can produce at very, very low cost, which is dollars. And the Chinese they can bring them back to the United States, buy treasury notes, invest in agricultural land, buy companies, buy American products, or they can use them in their trade with other people, like when they buy oil from the Saudis or other people. And those dollars don't ever come home to the U.S., but there's a demand for them because other people have use for them. So in that regard, unlike any other country, everyone uses them. And that means we have bigger deficits in goods produced. French had called in the 1960s the United States exorbitant privilege. The financing of American consumption is being passed off onto everyone else because we have something they want, which is the U.S. dollar, and we provide it to them. So that's inherent in the circumstance. And if we were to turn this around and say the U.S. should have a trade balance, or better yet, a trade surplus, then we'd be sucking dollars out of the world. There'd be fewer dollars out in the world for other people to have. International trade itself would grind to a halt, and it would be much more difficult for countries to trade with each other. There'd be less expansion, smaller markets for ourselves and for everyone else. And we've traditionally seen that as a bad thing, and this provision of the dollar for greasing the wheels of commerce as a good thing and very beneficial to us.
Yeah, and so is part of this idea too that the fact that people are buying dollars, holding dollars, the dollar is the trading currency and the reserve currency de facto, does that then drive the price of the dollar up and then make U.S. exports relatively more expensive and foreign imports relatively cheaper? And then does that affect the trade deficit too? So in some sense, is the trade deficit not really reflecting the balance of trade between the U.S. and the rest of the world?
Yeah, absolutely, Bob. You've put the finger on that, because there are two lines. There's the trade line in foreign accounts, and then there's the money line. And the amount of trade where we have a deficit is contrasted by the money line where we have a surplus. More people are buying dollars than are putting them in. So people are buying U.S. assets, if you will. Those assets could be things we make, soybeans. They could be things the government produces, like treasury bonds. They could be corporate bonds. It could be foreign direct investment into the United States. That's something that other countries could do. They have lots of avenues to spend dollars in the U.S. And then to use them outside the U.S. But it does push up the price of the dollar, which means the U.S. currency itself is worth more. So our banks and financial companies, it's easier for them to buy. It's easier for them to buy assets overseas, foreign companies, or raw materials or other products. In the same way, American consumers get cheaper goods. Our corporations get raw. The dollar is overvalued. Has a value with the trade, and it's that financial relationship that everyone wants to have. And so we could resolve some of these problems if we decided we didn't want the dollar to be the world's reserve currency. The Trump administration, like all American ones since the World War, does want the U.S. to be a reserve currency. Trump threatened India, Brazil, Russia, and China and South Africa with sanctions if they tried to move away from using the dollar as the world's reserve currency. But if we did, we would suffer the fate of what happened to the British after the Second World War, where the British pound before the end of the Second World War had been the world's reserve currency. Britain ran lots of trade deficits. There were lots of British pounds out in the world used by the Americans when they traded with the Brazilians and so forth. But after the war, people wanted dollars. The place that British pounds were good was back in Britain. So the money kept coming back in, which fueled, more money came into Britain. Inflation went up. So to combat that, they had to have high interest rates to drive down inflation, which stunted economic growth and also made it more difficult to borrow money and businesses to be active. So the solution on the money side, if you were to back away from global monetary leadership, is one that doesn't really give you much for industry. It will be one where you would have a much stricter monetary policy. And on top of that, the government's ability to run deficits would be very much curtailed as well. Taxes would likely have to go up, or spending down, or some combination of the two. And all of those things are not very attractive for American politicians.
Yeah, those are all political third rails, right? Raising taxes or not running deficits. We've not are willing to sort of bring the budget into balance since the mid 1990s, right? Isn't the last time?
Since the year 2000. Yeah,
2000.
Quarter of a century now. Yeah.
Since we're on deficits, and since the White House seems to be using trade deficits as an implicit indicator of tariffs or barriers to U.S. exports, I'll admit that my understanding of this is fairly rudimentary, but my understanding is that the U.S. leads, we're going to talk here about the Smiley curve, right? That the deficit may, with a particular country, China as an example, may not actually accurately represent the balance of trade because, for instance, an iPhone, this is the one we always use, an iPhone is counted, if it's assembled in China, it's U.S. export to China, and the entire value of that iPhone is counted as a Chinese export to the U.S. or U.S. import from China, when in actuality, the real money is made at the research and development stage and then the marketing and distribution stage. The middle stage, assembly, is very little value added. And so there are people saying, especially now that we're so fixated on trade deficits, that the way we're measuring the trade deficit is really not an accurate reflection of the trade balance. So much of that iPhone money stays in the U.S. The R&D part and the marketing is done by Apple in the U.S. and the assembly may be done, but very little money is actually made there. Is that? Do I have that right? Is that basically accurate? And what does that mean for our trade balance then?
Yeah, I mean, that is basically accurate. And it has been the sort of, in broad terms, the policy goal of American policymakers since the 1980s has been that the jobs in the international economy that we want to capture are the ones that are the high value added ones. The ones that are low value added tend to be very labor intensive and the margins are very small. The workers don't get much. So the best way forward if you're going to have a truly competitive international economy, when you've got a country with 1.6 billion, as you do in both the case of India and China, and then other countries with an average income that is very low, but a relatively decent skill base at the level, then that becomes much easier for them to mass produce products, even ones that require a degree of skill. That the real value is in the design and the marketing and the sort of ideational aspects. So we've focused since the 80s at the very least on trying to create a more educated workforce, one that can be a workforce of innovators. That's where the real value added is in the creating of new drugs, the creating of new products, the licensing fees and the patents. That's where the real money is. And there's not a whole lot of money in manufacturing. And if you're in the circumstance even of the Chinese, at the moment, then you've still got to worry that someone lower on the economic ladder in terms of per capita income, like say the Indians or the Vietnamese or the Bengalis, is going to come along and chew away at your position. And the U.S., the gap is even farther at the top. I mean, one way of measuring it is you look at the U.S. share of world trade is around 15 or 16%, based around 4 or 5% of the world's population. So in that regard, we're overachieving by about 3 times. The Chinese have about a third of the world's manufacturing capacity, and they have about 1/6 of the world's population. So they're overachieving by about double, but not nearly as much as us. So on that sort of outcome-based measure, the U.S. is coming out ahead. I mean, that policy of having a highly educated, innovative workforce is one that pays some dividends, but it's a bit of an illusion to think that then can translate across the whole spectrum of manufacturing. There are going to be some areas where the U.S. is just not competitive compared to the other. That's been a big challenge, really, certainly since the deindustrialization of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to try to how to pivot the American economy and the American workforce into higher paying, higher skill jobs. And that's had a lot of challenges to it. There have been a lot of great successes, but there's capitalism. One thing it's about is change and churn, and it's not simply for people at the bottom of the capitalist pyramid. It's for people at the top as well, because they always have people trying to catch up with them.
That's a great explanation. Thanks, Mark. So since this is normally a Eurasia podcast, I want to ask a Eurasia question, and that is, some countries were excluded from this latest round of tariffs, including Russia and Belarus. What's the explanation for that from the administration?
Well, the administration says with the sanctions on them that makes the tariffs redundant, that we've so curtailed and restricted economic exchange with Russia and Belarus down to the bare minimum of what is in our strategic interest, that putting tariffs on them is not going to, they're not a trade threat in that regard. And to the extent that we do trade with them, they're things that we really need. And in that sense, we'd be, harming ourselves if we cut off the few things and the small amounts of money that we were doing. It would hurt us more than them. That's the amount of and could type could want with from our
Ukraine is like look not celebration is normal play big and winners here, both in terms of the U.S. domestic economy. So what sectors of our economy stand to gain or lose the most from these tariffs, assuming some tariff structure stays in place? And then internationally, what countries are likely to be the biggest winners and losers from this tariff war?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, part of it depends upon what ultimate strategy the administration ends up pursuing with trade and other negotiations, and that still appears to be a bit vague. What will they be doing? It does seem that for 40 years Donald Trump has been very interested in here some are now those flat be but various forms of industrial policy, of subsidies, research grants, and so on to try to, move forward in what we see as the industries of the future. Battery technology, electric vehicles, solar, various energy things. That those would be industries we would want to be well positioned in. So the U.S. could be those industries, and related ones could benefit from this sort of activity. In terms of losses, it appears that if the Canadians and the Mexicans also are in the firing line there, and that poses a great many, at least I think for the automobile industry, was really in the last 40 years or so worked to become a lean, transnational machine. And a lot of the work is done in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and products will go back and forth across the border a dozen times in that construction. If there are even 10% tariffs, that's going to be very disruptive to a multi-billion-dollar industry that employs really millions of people in the direct industry and in the related ones. So that poses some problems. Internationally, there's, the constriction of world trade. If the U.S. is importing less, is going to hurt everyone who is an export-oriented country. Their model for growth, which includes a certain proportion of exporting to the United States, is going to undergo some challenges. Within that, though, the U.S. will become less competitive. Ironically, when you raise tariffs, your goods become less competitive because your industries have a protected domestic market. They don't go abroad and compete, so they tend not to be competitive internationally. So anyone who was competing with pretty highly established industries, I'm thinking primarily the European Union here, would have something of a competitive advantage. Now, whether that outweighs the loss of overall trade that will occur, I don't know. But in terms of the, market share, for instance, it's likely the European market share would expand because the U.S. trade deficit's not, by putting tariffs in, it's not going to be solved by additional American exports. Even though the U.S. is, depending upon how you measure it, the second or third largest exporter in the world after China and maybe the EU, it's not going to be resolved that way. It's going to be resolved by reducing imports into the United States. And that's an entirely different story than getting your economic sectors, lean, mean exporting. That's really not what's in the cards with the tariffs. What they're saying is we need to be able to protect a domestic market that is very, very big, the biggest in the world, and that there's plenty of space there for them to make money in. And that could be true. The U.S. has a very, very big market, but it does make it so that they won't compete internationally. And just as one example of this that goes back a century, the U.S. used to have an extremely competitive shipping and dredging industry. And then we passed the Jones Act for national security reasons to protect domestic shipping, preserve a supply of seamen, but it meant that the U.S. producers of ships didn't have to compete on international markets. They had the protected U.S. market, and eventually the Dutch and the Belgians, who, although they have small countries, to get their dredging and dredging equipment up to standard, they had to have an international market outside of Belgium and the Netherlands. So they competed internationally. And now the U.S. still does its dredging with the Army Corps of Engineers or Great Lakes, but internationally the U.S. doesn't have a presence at all because the technology isn't on par with the others. And you see it in shipbuilding that's gravitated first to South Korea and now increasingly to China.
So those are some of the sort of negative unintended effects of tariffs. But clearly tariffs work in some cases because many countries have them in place. So let me end with this. When are they a useful economic instrument?
Well, there are various reasons they could be useful. I mean, we kick things off by talking about revenue. It's a very simple way to bring in revenue. You compared to an income tax where you have to have every citizen and worker file an income tax and you have to be able to evaluate it. With tariffs, you have a handful of ports that things come into, and you have customs house, and you evaluate stuff and you pay it. So the bureaucratic footprint is less intrusive, less evasive. So for revenue, especially for economy with a weak bureaucracy, this is a pretty efficient way of getting money. Second, you might want to have it for national security reasons. There are some things, if you want to be able to have steel or sophisticated airplanes or cars or trucks of certain sorts that could be, shifted over to, more military uses, you might want to protect that sort of industry to keep that workforce and those assembly lines going. Sort of related to that is food security, that, the weather's pretty variable, things happen. You don't want to be in a circumstance where you're short on food. So, farming is, so we have a variety of protective measures for farmers, everything from price supports to field management to, tariffs. And it's in part designed because of, the market doesn't entirely work if you're just depending on the weather. And second, if you can't produce food, then people are starving. So you want to be able to ensure that you have more people working the land, or at least more coming off the land, even if you have fewer people, than you would if you just left it to the market to provide. Another argument is that people make is a sort of infant industries argument that says, hey, we're a developing economy, say the United States in the 19th century, or China or Japan later, say, look, or Brazil, they say, look, they're already established industrial competitors, but if we were given a chance, we'd be really good at producing shirts or cars or whatever. Give those industries a chance. And there are some big benefits to someone who's already producing and selling stuff. But if we can put tariffs on them, get some domestic skills and production going, then eventually we'll turn it around and we will export to the world, and that'll be our future industry. Now, there are tariffs involved, although the ultimate idea is you'd remove the tariffs because you could compete abroad. And the final reason is, maybe you just want to protect industries of people or groups that are politically powerful. And that's a domestic political debate that you might want to have, that people are used to being textile workers or coal miners or auto workers. They don't want their lives disrupted. And tariffs are one way of providing them with some job security. And the costs are diffused across the whole population in terms of slightly higher costs for clothing or for cars or what have you. And in exchange, the people in that very concentrated sector who might be politically well connected and they're political leaders have their minds concentrated to help them, that can have some political benefits as well.
Okay, so I think I heard you name about 5 reasons where they may make sense. Revenue generation, national security, strategic industries, food security, infant industries, and then sort of political benefits or dispensing political goods. Let me ask about, so the infant industries one is one that you hear a lot. Countries trying to essentially move up the value chain, right? From less value added to more value added manufacturing, and they impose tariffs to allow them to do that. It occurs to me that we're trying to move down the value chain with these tariffs. If you buy the rationale to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., that we are already about as high in the value chain as an economy as we can be. You said it earlier. It's a lot of intellectual property and a lot of very high-end technological economic sectors that the U.S. dominates in. The tariffs help you move down the value chain, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and is that something we should be trying to do?
Well, yeah, that's the case. I mean, it could be. I mean, on a sort of national security ground, if we think there's going to be big, great power competition and whatever, a large-scale war with China, then being able to gear up a manufacturing base is something we would want to have. There's an element of vulnerability there. Not that these iPhone factories or whatever can be converted into military factories or whatever, but but it could be the case for, say, automobiles or other sorts of things. But even that would suggest more of a strategic industries approach. And even within the manufacturing, I did see a thing on Forbes magazine, the speculation of how much it would take to reshore iPhone production to the U.S. iPhones currently cost maybe $1,000 each or maybe a little under. If we were to bring it back to the U.S. just on wage rates alone, it probably would move the iPhone price to $3,500. That's still assuming lots of the parts come from elsewhere. If you were to move all of the parts back and then take into account that the U.S. doesn't have the skills in, say, precision tool engineering, as Tim Cook, the Apple president, said, the U.S., you could fit all the precision tool engineers into a ballroom. In China, it'll take maybe 3 or 4 football stadiums to do. And that's not a skill that can be developed right away. They're not just simple things. And so the U.S. scale of production, instead of 100 million iPhones, might be in the low millions, and in which case, if you still had a solid demand for iPhones, they would become much more like the Mercedes, much more like the Rolls-Royce of things. They might cost $10,000 or $30,000 to $100,000 for an iPhone, just based upon the low levels of supply you would have. You could, to get an iPhone, we can get them for $1,000 because they're producing 100 million of them. But if they were only producing 4 million of them, all of a sudden it's only the top end. It becomes a very top end luxury good. And that price is much, much higher. It would become much more like, the sophisticated watches people like to have rather than a regular common consumer item.
It'd become a luxury good, huh? Something that very few people could afford.
Correct.
Well, $3,500 iPhones may be the one thing that tips the U.S. into revolution, because I'm not sure the American consumer is ready for that. That's much less $10,000 iPhone. So, yeah, but your explanation of why that could happen makes perfect sense. So, Mark, I learned something from every guest I have on this podcast, but I don't think I've ever learned more from a guest than I learned. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.